Picture this. It's a Friday evening, and somewhere in a kitchen, in a car, in earbuds on a commute, a 40-something puts on a song they haven't heard in 20 years. Maybe it's Soundgarden, maybe it's the Cranberries, maybe it's something off a mixtape that no longer physically exists but somehow still lives, completely intact, inside their chest. And for 3 minutes and 40 seconds, something shifts. Not nostalgia exactly, not grief exactly, something quieter and harder to name, something that feels, if they're being honest, more like recognition than remembrance, like being handed a mirror they forgot they'd left somewhere. Meanwhile, their teenage kid walks through the room, glances at the speaker, and keeps walking. The music is invisible to the kid, background noise from a different world. But the parent doesn't explain it, doesn't try to share it, just turns it up slightly after the kid leaves. That moment, that small, private, unremarked upon moment is worth paying attention to, because it isn't just about music, it never was. Today, we are going to look honestly at a generation defined, in many ways, by what it chose to hold on to. A generation that was told, in more ways than one, that its feelings were inconvenient. That has spent 30 years being called whatever, even by people who never really watched them. That built an entire emotional infrastructure out of songs that somehow still know where they live. Some of what we find may surprise you, including perhaps what it reveals about yourself. Let's go back to the beginning. Somewhere between 1965 and 1980, a generation was quietly born into a world that was unraveling at its seams and calling it progress. The Cold War was a low hum under everything. Divorce rates were climbing in ways no one had language for yet. Both parents went to work, not as a luxury but as a necessity, in houses where the economy had shifted just enough to make the old arrangements obsolete. The children of this era came home to empty houses. Not broken homes, necessarily. Not bad homes, just empty ones. The key was under the mat or on a string round your neck, and you let yourself in, made your own snack, watched your own television, and figured things out at a pace that nobody had quite planned for you. There was a term for these children: Latchkey kids. It was used almost neutrally at the time, the way you might describe a weather pattern, a demographic reality. It did not occur to most adults, and certainly not to the culture at large, that what was actually happening in those empty houses was a generation teaching itself how to be alone. And that lesson went very deep. The households these children grew up in were, for the most part, run by the emotional norms of the previous era. Feelings were things you managed, not things you processed. You didn't burden people. You didn't make a scene. You figured out pretty early which emotions were welcome at the dinner table and which ones you were supposed to take elsewhere, usually to your room, usually alone. What this produced, across millions of children who never compared notes on it, was a very specific kind of competence, a self-reliance that was genuinely impressive and genuinely costly at the same time. The ability to handle things, to troubleshoot, to not need too much from other people, to perform stability even when stability wasn't entirely what was happening inside. These children became very good at being fine. The cultural air they breathed during adolescence carried its own particular charge. The 1980s were loud and bright and deeply strange. Reagan's America promised a kind of optimism that felt, even to teenagers, vaguely unconvincing. The music of the early part of their adolescence was slick and surface level, full of synthesizers and hairspray, and a relentless cheerfulness that somehow made the underlying anxieties louder by trying so hard to drown them out. And then something broke open. Around 1991, in a specific recording studio in Seattle, and then very quickly everywhere else, something happened to popular music that felt almost violent in its honesty. Grunge was not polished. It was not aspirational. It was not asking you to dance or to feel good about yourself. It was a collection of people in flannel shirts screaming the subtext that pop culture had been editing out for a decade. This doesn't feel right. Something is wrong with this picture. I am not okay in ways I don't have words for. For a generation that had spent their entire childhoods being told they were fine, that everything was fine, this landed like recognition. Not just grunge. Alternative rock in its broadest sense. The Smiths for the kids who felt too much too quietly. 9 Inch Nails for the ones who felt too much too loudly. Alanis Morissette for everyone who had been quietly furious at something they couldn't fully name. The Cranberries, Pearl Jam, R.E.M., Radiohead. A wave of music that collectively agreed, emotional complexity is real, it is valid, and we are going to put it directly into the chord structure. For a generation whose emotional education had largely consisted of don't be too much, this was not just music, it was oxygen. And here is the thing about oxygen: once you've had it, you don't forget what it felt like to breathe. What does it do to a person to grow up in a house where self-reliance is not a virtue being taught, but simply a reality being lived? Where you learn, not from instruction but from experience, that needing people is a gamble that doesn't always pay off. It writes something into the emotional operating system that takes decades to fully read. Erik Erikson, in Tracing the Stages of Human Development, described childhood as the period where we form our most foundational beliefs about the world, whether it is safe, whether it is reliable, whether other people can be counted on. These beliefs don't form through philosophy. They form through the accumulation of small daily experiences, repeated thousands of times, until they harden into something that feels less like belief and more like fact. What this generation learned, not through trauma in many cases, but through simple, consistent experience, is that the self is the most reliable unit of support. That waiting for someone to notice you need help is a strategy that produces disappointment, that it is better, faster, and safer to handle things yourself. This is not a complaint, it is an observation. Because here is what that emotional programming also produced: a generation that is startlingly functional in a crisis, that does not dissolve when things go wrong, that has a tolerance for ambiguity, for difficulty, for the unglamorous work of keeping things together that many who grew up in more cushioned environments genuinely lack. The person at the party who is quietly making sure everyone has what they need, while also appearing to be casually leaning against the wall with a drink that's very often one of them. The one in the office who takes the difficult project not because they want the recognition, but because they actually don't fully trust anyone else to handle it correctly. That's very often them too. There is a particular kind of competence that self-reliance produces. It is genuine, it is earned, and it is, in ways that took this generation a long time to recognize, also a form of loneliness. They learned to stop calling loneliness. Because when you learn early that depending on yourself is safer than depending on others, you become very good at building an inner life, a rich, self-sufficient, inward-facing world. The kind of world that can be accessed alone, in a quiet room, with music that knows all the words to the feelings you never figured out how to say out loud. The traits that define this generation are not hard to find. Once you know what you're looking at, there is the independence, fierce, sometimes overcorrected, sometimes indistinguishable from isolation. The ability to function without external validation that coexists quietly with a hunger for genuine recognition that they rarely ask for and occasionally receive. There is the sarcasm, the dry, knowing humor that operates like a second language. The irony that isn't detachment but is performed as detachment, because detachment is safer than sincerity in rooms that might not be safe for sincerity. This generation was funny in a specific way, not the buoyant, optimistic funny of earlier generations, and not the anxious, oversharing funny of the generation that followed. It was the funny of people who could see the gap between what the world claimed to be and what it actually was, and found the gap darkly hilarious. There is the adaptability. Born into analog, came of age in the first wave of digital, watched the internet arrive as adults and learnt it anyway, are now navigating middle age in a world that seems to restructure itself every 18 months and have, without fanfare, just kept adapting. Not because it's easy, but because adapting is simply what they do. It's the baseline setting. And then there is the loyalty. This one surprises people. The generation that raised the concept of slacker culture, that wore cynicism like a badge, that had a fraught relationship with institutions and authority, is, in its personal relationships, often deeply and quietly loyal to the people who earned it, to the friendships that survived enough shared difficulty to feel real, to the music that was there during the formation years, when everything else felt unreliable. Which brings us back to the music. Why does a 45-year-old who has adult responsibilities and contemporary taste and full access to everything ever recorded keep returning to the same albums from 1994? The easy answer is nostalgia. And the easy answer misses the point almost entirely. Nostalgia is about the past. What this generation experiences when they put on Super Unknown or Jagged Little Pill or OK Computer is not exactly about the past. It is about contact. Contact with a version of themselves that was allowed encouraged even by the music to feel the full weight of what they were feeling without being required to resolve it or perform it or explain it. The music of the early 90s was, in a way that hasn't been sufficiently examined, one of the first cultural spaces where an entire generation's interior life was taken seriously, not fixed, not optimized, not turned into inspiration, just witnessed, held, allowed to be complicated. For kids who grew up being told their feelings were inconvenient, this was not a small thing. Bessel van der Kolk, in his work on how experience lives in the body, talks about how certain kinds of emotional experiences become encoded not just in memory, but in something deeper in the nervous system, in muscle memory, in the way a specific key or tempo can bypass language entirely and land directly in the body. This is not sentimentality, this is physiology. When this generation puts on a song they last heard at 17, they are not just remembering, they are being returned to a state, a specific emotional frequency that still exists inside them intact in a way that nothing in the adult world quite knows how to reach. The armor they built over decades is very good, competent, functional, held together with irony and self-reliance and the practiced calm of people who learned early that visible emotion creates complications. But the music gets under the armor. It always did. It was built for exactly that. Now, let's talk about where this psychology goes to work. In professional environments, this generation occupies an unusual position, old enough to have moved into significant authority, young enough to still be building, and constitutionally disinclined to trust institutions in the way that makes climbing them feel like a natural aspiration. They are, as managers, often exceptional, not because management theory came naturally, it didn't, but because the core skills of management are, at their foundation, the skills of someone who learned to read rooms, anticipate needs, handle difficulty without theatrics, and keep things moving without requiring applause for doing so. They also have a specific and complicated relationship with authority that reflects their formation exactly. A generation that grew up watching the major institutions of its childhood, the government, the church, the corporation, the nuclear family as cultural ideal, all experience very public failures, tends not to mistake authority for competence. This is not nihilism, it's pattern recognition. If the adults in your early life were well-intentioned but overextended, and the institutions they trusted were demonstrably fallible, you learn a pragmatism about hierarchy that simply does not include the assumption that position equals wisdom. This produces workers who are excellent at the actual work and occasionally maddening to manage from above because they will follow a directive they believe in and quietly dismantle one they don't, with a patience and indirection that can take years to detect. It also produces leaders who are, at their best, deeply reluctant to pull rank, who prefer to earn credibility through demonstrated usefulness rather than claim it through title, who have, because of this, occasionally been passed over by people who are louder about their own value. They notice this, they file it, they return to their offices, put their headphones in and get back to work. And then there is the weight of right now, the particular pressures that sit on a generation in its mid-40s to late 50s in this specific historical moment. Parents who are aging in a healthcare system that is not designed to make that easy. Adult children who needed more than the economic landscape of the previous generation prepared anyone to offer. Mortgages taken on during one set of financial assumptions now living inside a different set of financial realities. Career paths that assumed a certain trajectory intersecting with a labour market that restructured itself while they were in the middle of it. And under all of that, something harder to name. Something that shows up in the body before it shows up in the mind. A low, persistent tiredness that isn't quite sleep deprivation. A flatness on Sunday afternoons that isn't quite sadness. A sense of performing the life rather than fully inhabiting it that isn't quite depression, but that high-functioning people in demanding circumstances know very intimately. Burnout is too simple a word for it. What it actually is, for many in this generation, is the cost of decades of being the person who handles things. The toll of having built an identity around competence and self-sufficiency in a world that keeps requiring both at volume, without pause. The armor is still on, it's heavier now, and they still aren't taking it off in public. What they are doing, increasingly, is taking it off in the car, on the commute home, in the kitchen alone before anyone else is awake. In the 40 minutes at the end of a long day when they finally have the room to themselves and they put on something they've known for 30 years. In their closest relationships, this generation carries its formation the way everyone does, in patterns that were set long before the current relationship existed. The children of overextended or emotionally unavailable parents often become, in a profound irony, very attentive parents. They see the gap that existed in their own childhoods with painful clarity, and they are determined to fill it for their children, to be present, to be emotionally available, to say the things that weren't said to them. And this is real. The effort is genuine. The outcomes, in many cases, are genuinely better. But the overcorrection has its own cost. The parent who overgives, because they know what undergiving feels like, can blur the boundary between meeting a child's needs and trying to retroactively meet their own. The partner who is fiercely loyal can also be fiercely controlling about intimacy, slow to show vulnerability with anyone who hasn't fully proven themselves safe. The emotional holding pattern: keep it managed, keep it functional. Let the music do the things, the words won't, can be limiting in adult intimacy in ways this generation is often the last to see in themselves. Not because they are unaware. Awareness is not generally this generation's problem, but there is a difference between understanding your own patterns and having the sustained emotional environment to safely unlearn them. That environment requires trust. Trust requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is the thing this generation is most skilled at performing and most careful about actually practicing. The friendships, though, the deep ones, the ones that survived the formation years, that made it through the decades of scattered geography and life stage divergence and long silences that somehow didn't break anything, those are taken very seriously. They are the container that holds something the more polished adult world can't quite access. The place where the armor can come down a little, the people who remember who you were before you got good at being fine. Something shifts around midlife for people who have spent their entire adult lives oriented outward, toward productivity, toward achievement, toward keeping everything running at the required speed. There is a turning inward, not a retreat, not a failure of ambition, something more accurate than either of those words, a revaluation, a quiet recalibration of what actually matters at the level below achievement and above comfort. A willingness to ask, sometimes for the first time with genuine seriousness, what do I actually want? Not what was expected of me, not what I can accomplish, what do I want? For this generation, that question is often asked in the company of music, because the music has always been where the real internal conversation was happening. The places where the answers to questions they weren't yet ready to ask were already waiting. They are asking them now. This is not giving up. It is, if you track it against the psychological literature on adult development, against Erikson's stages, against the research on what actually produces meaning in the second half of life, one of the more sophisticated moves available to a human being, the capacity to release the identity built in the first half of life, provisionally, and search for what wants to grow in its place. Not everyone makes this move. Many people don't. The ones who do tend to become, in the later decades of their lives, something rare, people who have actually met themselves, not the version built for survival, the one underneath. And that version, it turns out, has very specific tastes in music, has known what it felt like to feel things fully, uncurated, without the requirement of resolution, has been waiting, patient and intact, behind 30 years of being excellent at being fine. There is a specific thing that happens to a generation when it is shaped by difficulty, and they're never quite seen for what that difficulty actually was. Not disaster. Not the named, collectively acknowledged disasters that societies build memorials to, something smaller and more pervasive. The daily low-level experience of not quite belonging to the narrative, of being in between the boomers' optimism and the millennials' networked expressiveness, of being fluent in both analog and digital without being native to either, of having emotional depth that was formed in an era that had very few containers for it. This generation built its own container, largely out of 3-chord progressions and the specific sound of someone screaming something that had never been said that honestly in a major recording before. They still carry it. The music and what it means, the frequency it returns them to, the proof it contains that they felt things big and real and complicated things long before the culture gave anyone permission to feel them. And if that sometimes means a 47-year-old turns up the volume when they're alone in the car, if it means that some things never stop being true just because you're old enough now to theoretically know better, maybe that's not failure to grow up. Maybe that's a refusal to let the most honest version of yourself go quiet. If any part of this felt familiar, if something here names something you've been carrying without quite having the words for it, I'd like to hear from you. Not what song takes you back, something deeper than that? What did that music give you during the years you needed it most that the world around you wasn't quite offering? I think the answers to that question tell us something true about what human beings actually need from art, and I think the answers will be worth reading. If you want more of this kind of work psychology examined through the lived texture of a real human life, not through clinical distance, then stay close to this channel. What we are building here is not a content library. It is a way of looking at yourself and the people around you with more precision, more compassion, and more honesty than most of us were ever taught. That kind of seeing changes things quietly, without announcement. The way this generation learned to do almost everything,